I would be remiss if I did not thank you again for your hospitality and your kindness and your encouragement and your friendship while we've studied together these last couple of days. You have something special here. Lord willing, and things stay normal, I will probably speak at about 45 different events. Some of them churches, some of them corporations, some of them universities. And without trying to sound self-aggrandizing or braggadocious, I get a feel for people when I'm around them. And what you guys have here is very special. And you should rejoice in that and share that and be uplifted in it. Let's study together a little bit from Hebrews. We'll start in chapter 12. Actually, we'll start in chapter 11, but I'll talk about chapter 12 a second. The letter to the Hebrews is just that. It's a writer, and we don't know who. I'll slip and say Paul. I don't mean that. I'm just used to saying Paul wrote this. I really think Apollos probably wrote it, but that's just me. Can't prove that, but you can't prove he didn't. So, but I got a few minutes on my hands here. I think it's Dave Baggett or Kerry Robinson, one of my SWAT cop buddies. I told a guy one time, he said, "You ain't got to be scared to get whipped." And I told that to Randy Powell, our preacher. He goes, "No, but it helps." And so I guess he's true about that. The Hebrew writer is writing to people who were practicing Judaism and got converted to the church. And then because they started being persecuted because of their Christianity, they were quitting Christianity and going back to the temple. It'd be real hard if you grew up in a tradition where worshiping God was regimented and you had the sacrifices and you had your priest, and then you left that and you're losing your ability to work and you're being arrested and you're having your land confiscated. And look over there on top of that hill, on top of Mount Moriah, and the temple is still standing. And the priests are going about their business. And everything's happening as it always has happened on the Sabbath day, and nobody's bothering them. How easy would it be to just step away from Christianity and go back into that? And so the Hebrew writer is talking to these folks and trying to get them not to quit. He's trying to get them not to give up for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you just read the book of Hebrews, it is a masterful argument about the superiority of the message of Christ, the priesthood of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ. He's showing that Christianity fulfills everything that the old law required. Now, without getting too far, get the wheels in the ditch too far, it's Sunday afternoon, we've all eaten. What they were doing in the first century was not Judaism. It wasn't covenant Judaism. That covenant had been broken. They'd been taken away into captivity. They stayed in captivity for 70 years. They came back and they built the temple. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. But the covenant, the Old Testament, never authorized a synagogue, never authorized the Sanhedrin court. There were 70 elders with Moses, but there's 72 people in the Sanhedrin. And you had the big Sanhedrin and a little Sanhedrin. You had a small Sanhedrin in every village, and you had a big Sanhedrin that lived in Jerusalem. Their job as the Sanhedrin was to vet the Messiah. You had one job. You've heard that statement before. All right. They missed that. And as you read the New Testament, what do you hear about? Passover, 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 Passover. Passover was not a redemptive ritual. The redemption of Israel, the atonement of Israel, was taking place in a festival or a sacrifice known as the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Probably only maybe 3 references to that in the New Testament. Peter will refer to Jesus as a propitiation. Paul will refer to Jesus as propitiation. And John the Baptizer will see Jesus and say, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." You see, by the time you get to the New Testament, they're not celebrating the Day of Atonement. Because on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would put on special clothes. He'd take a bath. He'd wear special undergarments and a special ephod. He would take the blood of a sacrifice. He would sprinkle it on the people. He would make a sacrifice for himself. And then he would enter into the holy place. And inside the holy place was a veiled area, a curtain area. And sticking out of those curtains were two long poles. Those poles were attached to the Ark of the Covenant. You could place the Ark of the Covenant in and out of the most holy place without ever stepping in the most holy place because of these poles. And one time a year, one time in his priesthood probably, the priest would enter through the veil and walk in and sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant. Jesus is referred to in Peter's letter as the hilasteron. When Jesus is called the propitiation, he literally calls him the mercy seat, the cover of the Ark of the Covenant. If you went to Solomon's temple, if you went to Herod's temple in Jerusalem, and you walked in that edifice, and you walked past the altar, and you walked past the basin, and you walked into the holy place, and then you stood there in front of that veil. The veil in the temple, in the modern temple, was as thick as a man's hand. That's not from palm to knuckle, but from pinky to thumb. You had a thick veil of the curtain. And the priest stands there, and if he opened up that veil and walked into the most holy place, he was empty. There was no Ark of the Covenant there. There hadn't been an Ark of the Covenant there in 600 years. Jeremiah 3:16 said the time's coming when you won't think about the ark, you won't look for the ark, you won't mention the ark, you won't say the ark of the covenant, and you won't build another one. They couldn't do atonement. It was a broken system. And they were waiting on the Messiah to come and redeem Israel. Now when Jesus comes, he becomes the Yom Kippur sacrifice. He becomes the Passover lamb. And I'll argue that because they took him outside the city to murder him, he became the scapegoat. He fulfilled every requirement of everything that had to happen under the old law to make people perfect or righteous. But you get to the New Testament, and they've got this broken system, and then Jesus comes and fulfills the law, and they get a little persecution, and because of that persecution, they abandon Christianity and go back to a system that had been broken for 570 years. And so the Hebrew writer's writing them and begging them not to quit. So Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance or patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, who endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. When the Hebrew writer's begging his audience not to quit, he uses a couple of arguments. He uses a couple of places of reasoning. The first thing he says is, because you are surrounded by witnesses. Now, the word he uses there for witnesses probably be better translated as martyrs. This is not people standing in a football stadium watching you. These are people who, because of what they believed about the promise of God, endured some terrible situations. And so the first thing he does, he says, you've got to understand that there are people who went before you and they did not abandon their faith. And if you decide that you're going to abandon your faith, then you've got to walk through this crowd and explain to them as you go out why you can't stay. Now, when you think about the crowd that they're in, that'd be a tough crowd to play to. An important point that he'll make in Hebrews chapter 11 is what these people's faith did for them. Notice, if you will, Hebrews chapter 11. Let's do verse 32. And what shall I say more? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. I got a list of guys I ain't talked about yet. And I don't have time to do that. But this list of people, verse 33, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness became strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens, and women received their dead back to life again. He said, I'm telling you about these people who live by faith, Noah and Abraham and Moses, and I don't even have time to tell you about Samson and Jephthah and Barak and the prophets. And look what these guys did. They ran off invading armies. They survived lion attacks. They dealt with fire and lived through it. They quenched the violence of the sword. They even had their dead raised back to life. Man, you read what these people did, and it's like a superhero comic book ending. It makes every Avenger movie look boring because those Avenger movies are made up. These guys really did this stuff. He said, if you want to quit you just remember, oh, I can't do this. You look at the people who had faith in what they did. Now the kicker is the next verse. Others, these guys had superhero comic book endings. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskin and goatskins. They were destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom this world was not even worthy. And they wandered around in mountains and sheepskins and goatskins, and they lived in dens and caves of the earth. He said, you got this group of people, and they had faith, and they conquered nations. They stopped the mouths of lions. They quenched the violence of the sword. They escaped the fire. They ran off invading armies, and their women had their dead raised to life. Other people with the exact same faith were stoned and murdered and tortured and cut in half, wore animal skins and lived in holes. He said, let me tell you something, friends. Your faith will not affect your circumstances. Just because you have faith doesn't mean life will be easy. Just because you have faith doesn't mean things will go well for you. Just because you have faith doesn't mean you're immune from these things. But what the Hebrew writer is saying, don't let your circumstances affect your faith. And if you get to the place where you go, hey, this is too hard and I'm going to quit, then when you walk out of the room, you're pushing your way through a crowd of people who either because of victory or defeat said, I'm not letting go of my faith. In 2009, I was 106 miles away from home. I stopped at a store to buy some ammunition, and my large intestine ruptured. Now, they don't know why it happened, but when it happens, you'll know it. It felt like somebody's flossing my lower back with barbed wire. And I went to the ground. I got up, decided I got to get to my dad's house. I got in my little truck. I rolled down the windows. It was 14 degrees, and I was blowing sweat. I'd have to pull over, wake myself up because I was passing out. Then I saw a sign for the hospital. I thought, I think I'll go there. Got to the hospital, got out, leaned against the truck. My climbing stand was back there. My box of hunting clothes was back there. I said, I probably need to put that in the cab of the truck. So with an 18-inch wound in my intestines and junk spilling into my body cavity, I unloaded my truck. And then I walked into the hospital under my own power. Thank the Lord. The nurse at the desk, when she saw me, went, if an emergency room nurse does that to you, you're in bad shape. Months later, I'm better. Had some surgeries. They put my pipes back together. I'm getting some wood for a project for my daughter. We unload the wood at Lowe's. She gets in the car and said, Dad, I got a splinter. Dad, my splinter hurts. Dad, we probably have to pull over and deal with this splinter. I said, you're talking to a man whose intestines ruptured and he went to the hospital by himself. I don't want to hear about your splinter. She said, I'll sit over here and be quiet. That's what the Hebrew writer's saying. When you decide you've had enough and you're going to quit Christianity because it's not popular, or they don't like you on Facebook, or somebody made fun of you at school, or somebody's hassling you at work, and you decide you're going to quit, you take your splinter and you walk through this crowd of people that were fed to lions and burned at the stake and cut in half, and you tell them why your splinter's so bad you got to quit. That's what he's reminding his audience. Your faith won't make you immune from these things. But don't let these things destroy your faith. Then he says, after you decide that you're in the wrong crowd to be making excuses, because you're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses, you take an inventory of your life and you look at the things that easily beset or easily entangle you, and you get rid of them. Now, had I made it to the hunting woods the day that I had my little adventure, suppose I'd been sitting in a red oak tree and had that severe abdominal pain cavity and climbed out of that tree and decided, man, I got to get back to that truck. Do you think I'd have taken my climbing stand with me? Absolutely not. I've got a stainless steel bolt-action 30-06 rifle my wife bought me with her first check as a teacher. Do you think I'd have carried that rifle out of those woods? I knew what was going on inside me wasn't good. I didn't know what it was. But I had the idea that I might die. In fact, I told that doctor in Anniston, he said, I think you've had a rupture. We're going to put you to sleep. You'll wake up. You'll have a colostomy bag. You'll be here 10 days. I said, put me on a helicopter. Send me to Huntsville. He goes, you won't survive a helicopter trip to Huntsville. I said, well, let's do it here then. But knowing that I had to get out of, I wouldn't have carried anything with me. I'd have left my climbing stand. I'd have left my rifle. I'd have left my bow. The Hebrew writer says, you think about where you are, and you think about where you want to be, and you think about what's slowing you down to get there. Now, when you put it in those kind of terms, none of the decisions you'll make this week about your Christianity are hard to make. Because it's just as simple as I need to be here, and I can't get from here to there and carry this with me. There's a place over in North Georgia called Springer Mountain, Georgia. It used to be the beginning of the Appalachian Trail. I got a buddy that walked the whole thing from beginning to end, Halo Fernandez. You guys do Lads to Leaders? That's Brother Zorn's son-in-law, Halo. His middle daughter, Rhonda's a good friend of mine. I got Brother Zorn's bookshelves in my office. When Brother Zorn died, they gave me his bookshelves. But Halo got on that trail and walked from there to Maine. He said, when you get on Springer Mountain, Georgia, you get an elevation change of about 1,800 feet. People come from up north and decide they're going to walk our hills in Alabama and in North Georgia. And they've never met Mr. Humidity. I'm going to walk the Appalachian Trail and I'm going to be comfortable. I'm going to take a cook stove and a thick sleeping pad and 3 extra pairs of boots. You start climbing a hill in North Georgia and the temperature's 110, the humidity's 120%. Guess what happens to your backpack? You start donating stuff. You can get any piece of camping equipment you want on Springer Mountain, Georgia, and it's free. Because people start walking up those hills in that Georgia humidity, and they go, you know what? I think I'll leave this. That's what the Hebrew writer says. He says, you look at the crowd that went before you, and they didn't quit, and then you just simply look at your life, and you say, this is where I am, this is where I want to be, and I can't get there and haul this attitude, activity, friendship, job, whatever it is that keeps you from getting to where. He said, if this were a race, what would you do to run a better race? What would you do to run a more perfect race? Now, I don't want to be ridiculous, but I'm just going to ask this question. Anybody here think they can outrun me in a 100-yard dash? This young man right here does. You didn't even have to say it. He went, whatever. He said, that guy's legs were any shorter, they wouldn't reach the ground. I get it. I'll be 60 next year if I make it. How old are you? 20. He could outrun me in his sleep. Okay? What's your name, sir? Jeremiah. Jeremiah, let's do this. Let's go out here. If you could find a flat spot in northern Mississippi, and let's mark off 100 yards and let's race. Now, here's the deal, Jeremiah. The winner lives forever. Got it? Now, you can't trip me and you can't kick me in the leg, all right? I'll tell you what I'll do for you. I'll give you $1 million. And if you'll carry that $1 million while we race, I'll let you keep it. Now, just to help you out, 1 million $1 bills weighs a metric ton. Now, he's 20 years old and he's in shape, but guess what? You cannot run me dragging a bag of money. I don't care who you are. Now, look at Jeremiah shaking that head. He said, look, if I got to outrun that old man and live forever, I'll pass on the money. Okay? I have no idea why you're sitting by yourself in this room with all these pretty girls in here. I'm just saying, all right? Darby's birthday was this week. She's 19. I didn't say that out loud, all right? I'll let you have anybody in this room you want. But you got to carry them while we race. Shake hard pass. Why? Because he knows he can't win a race carrying somebody else. Now, young people, you find somebody that'll run that race with you, that's a deal you can't beat. But this young man's smart enough, and look, he can outrun me. But he can't outrun me carrying a bag of money. He can't outrun me carrying another person. I'll give you any vehicle you want. I'll give you a Ferrari. I'll give you a Lamborghini. I'll combine the two, give you a Ferrari-Guinea. How about that? The only problem is you got to put it in neutral and put a harness on and drag it while we race. Already shaking his head. You know why? Because he knows he cannot run me dragging a car. And all you've got to do is go home this afternoon and make a list. And go, can I win that race with this person, with this hobby, with this habit, with this possession, with this attitude? And you do just what our friend Jeremiah just did. He'll look at you like you're an idiot and go, I'm not doing that. That's all you've got to do. This is where I am. This is where I want to be. And what am I holding on to? What am I carrying? What am I dragging that's slowing me down? And once you identify that it's slowing you down, you pass on it. Now, the hard part of this is that some of those things are hard to give up. I've got a friend I deer hunted with him. He was 75 when we deer hunted together, and he wanted to go rappelling on his birthday. I took him rappelling at 75. Oldest guy I've ever had on a rope. He walked down the aisle one night at a church building and was baptized into Christ. On Thursday morning, he went into the beer plant that he worked at, and he resigned. And he lived in the same house. Never bought a bigger house, never bought a nicer car, because he said, I can't be a Christian and bottle beer. He walked away from it. And he's lived in the same house and raised a faithful Christian family. But he said, I can't have that job and have my Lord. You don't think that was a hard decision to make? Young ladies, you may find some old boy. And he may be Prince Charming. Now, if he's a loser, it's easy to kick him to the curb. That ain't no problem. But here's a guy, he's nice and he's sweet and he's handsome, but he's not going to help you get to heaven. You got to get rid of him. The hardest thing you'll ever do as a Christian is break up with somebody that you're in love with that won't help you get to heaven. What happens when you have to make a choice like that? Well, the Hebrew writer says this. Looking, this is verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God. He said the way that Jesus dealt with circumstances on earth is he didn't look at what was happening to him right now, but he looked at the promise God had given him. And because of what he wanted in the future, controlled what he chose in the present. Discipline is defined as choosing between what you want now and what you want most. And there are some decisions that we make, and they're hard to make. Some of these decisions about Christianity are counterintuitive. And if I make that choice, it's going to hurt me. It's going to hurt my education. It's going to hurt my income. It's going to hurt my friendships. It's going to hurt where I can live, where I can't live. When Jesus was being nailed to a cross, instead of thinking about what was happening to him right here, right now, he remembered that his Father said, there is joy that awaits you. And because he could have a future focus and not a present focus, he could change how he responded to difficult circumstances. So the Hebrew writer says, you remember people before you have dealt with this, if you want to make excuses of them. Number 2, take a fearless moral inventory and look at your life and ask yourself, what's keeping me from running my race? And then when you have to make a difficult, painful decision, you use the same decision model Jesus did. Because Jesus took his eyes off of now and looked at what God had promised, and based on what God has promised, what was happening right now wasn't a big deal. Then he does this section, chapter 12, verse 3, probably all the way down to verse 11. He does this real interesting discussion where he says, when you suffer, you should view any form of suffering as the same function as you do discipline. Now, it doesn't say that God reaches down from heaven and thumps us. It doesn't say that God intentionally does things. But what he says is that when God says you do it this way, it's good for you. And when God says you don't do it this way, it's bad for you. And when you make those choices, God lets you live with your consequences. And anytime you suffer, it's a form of discipline. When I teach parenting classes, discipline is putting stress in a relationship so the result is growth. And so when you encounter a difficult situation, tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, character produces hope. And so anytime I'm in a difficult situation, I look at that and think, hey, God's letting me live in a place just like a father would let me learn a tough lesson. And fathers who discipline their kids love their kids. Fathers who don't discipline their kids don't love their kids. Anything that you suffer has a discipline function. It makes us better, faster, stronger, able to endure more. And anything that you do that requires discipline also requires suffering. You can't get good at anything unless you put in the reps. No pain, no gain. And spell no either way. N-O pain, N-O gain, or K-N-O-W, K-N-O-W. Anything that requires discipline requires some suffering. All amount of suffering is in some way, shape, or form discipline. So the Hebrew writer is telling his audience, if you're struggling with maintaining your commitment to Christianity, look at the people who've been before you didn't quit. Take a moral inventory of your life and decide, hey, what do I need to get rid of to help me run better? And then when you have to make a difficult decision, look at the decision-making metrics that Jesus did. I take my eyes off now and look to then, rather than only focusing on what's happening to me now, and then recognize that just because you're suffering doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Suffering has a discipline function. And then he kind of reminds us of some real important things about becoming better at what we do. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 12. Therefore, because of this suffering, because of this discipline, therefore strengthen the hands that hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be discarded, but rather healed. I really think what he's doing here is pointing out to those people, there are some things in our lives that are weaknesses. And if you take a weakness and you don't address it, guess what happens to it? It gets worse. Oh, I tweaked my shoulder and I didn't want to take any time off, and then by the time they go in there and look at that shoulder, they say, hey, we'd have rebuilt this 6 months ago, but there ain't nothing there to work with now. It's like everything. We tend to stay in our comfort zone, and we don't like to get out of our comfort zone. Guys who like to power lift hate cardio. Guys who like cardio hate to power lift. You give me a guy with the strength of a power lifter and the cardio of a marathon runner, and you've got a monster. Shoot him first. Okay, you put your hands on a guy like that. If you can weaponize your cardio, all things being equal, cardio is going to win this thing. But most people don't like to train in an area where they're uncomfortable. Now, I'm not a good rock climber. I climb rocks because when you climb rocks, it's the only thing you can think about is climbing rocks. I'm not an adrenaline junkie. I don't enjoy being scared. I don't like to fall, and falling's part of the deal. But when I first started rock climbing, it was a power game. I do power climbing. Look at me, I'm not built like a ballerina. These modern day climbers, they're skinny little fellows, and they do some. You'd be surprised what a guy. If you never watched the Netflix documentary Free Solo about a kid named Alex Honnold, he climbs without gear. He climbed a 3,000-foot granite cliff with nothing but his gym shorts and his chalk bag. He's not very smart. He won't live very long. But anyway, when I started climbing, we didn't do any gymnastic moves. It was all power climbing. Chimneys and liebacks and inside corners. And it was just a monster sport. You get climbing a modern-day crack system, you stack your hands in that crack. When I started crack climbing, you put both hands in and you pull. And if the rock doesn't rip, you go up. And that's called a Gaston, is what that move is called. And I climbed regularly for a long, long time. When I turned 30, I thought, 30's too old for anybody to be climbing. I thought I'd go out to North Carolina, do a multi-pitch climb. That's where you use the same rope several times. I was going to do a 5-pitch climb, and I was going to turn in my climbing career. Because 30 years old, that's ridiculously old, right? So I'm going to climb at 30, and I turned 59 in March, and I'm still climbing. But at 30, I was going to be done. I was climbing with a guy from North Carolina outward bound named Doc Klein. And we were going to do 2 or 3 warm-up climbs, make sure we could self-rescue, make sure we could partner rescue, and then we were going to climb a 500-foot granite face called Table Rock. The second day we were there, Doc, the guy that I was with, Doc Klein, said, hey, I want you to climb this little wall, probably a 45-foot wall called the Chimneys. He said, I want to see if you can climb this wall. I was like, Doc, I can run up this wall. He said, but I want you to wear a blindfold. And I thought, well, who are you, Obi-Wan Kenobi? Well, I put this blindfold on, and instead of reaching up as high as I could and trying to pull the rock down on me, and then if it didn't move, I moved up, I put my hands here, and instead of pulling onto the rock, I held onto the rock and placed a foot. And I climbed this thing blindfolded, and I climbed it using my feet more than my hands. When I got back down on the ground, Doc said, well, what I noticed about your climbing style, Lonnie, is that you depend on your upper body strength and you don't know how to use your feet. World-class climbers use their feet, not their arms. And it changed my mindset. And so instead of having a bunch of pull-up bars and a bunch of weighted pull-up machines at the house, I built me some little edges that I could walk across the side of. I got a special pair of climbing shoes. I can stand on the brick wall because they're made with a hard edge like the bottom of Billy Goat's foot. And I'm still climbing. Why? I address my weaknesses, not my strengths. And the Hebrew writer says, you look at your life and you look at where your discipline needs to improve, whether it's your Bible study habit, whether it's your prayer life, whether it's your church attendance, whether it's your benevolence work, whether it's your service, whether it's your fellowship, or whether it's anything. He said, you look at the areas in your life that are difficult, and instead of shying away from the places where you're uncomfortable, you get hip deep in that, and then the hands that hang down and the feeble knees, and you make straight paths for your feet, and then those things that are dislocated will be healed. So the Hebrew writer says you got to be honest about what's slowing you down, and you got to be honest about the areas that you need to improve on. And then the last thing he does in this discussion about not quitting is he reminds us of Esau. And he kind of takes us back, and he revisits the idea about what you want now versus what you want most. Verse 14. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And look carefully, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently and with tears. You guys know the story of Esau. He comes in from a hunting trip. He's tired. He's weary. He's famished. He's exhausted. He sees his little brother cooking some red soup, and he says, hey, let me have some of your red stew. His brother says, let me have your birthright. Esau, in an emotional-based thinking, goes from I'm tired, I'm hungry, I'm famished, and I'm weary to I'm going to starve to death. How many times have we done that when we make choices? I'm sad, I'm depressed. I'm nervous, I'm anxious. My husband and I had a fuss. We've never gotten along. Somebody at church disappointed me. All those folks are hypocrites. How many times do we take a normal emotion and blow it out of proportion. And his brother says, well, if you want my soup, I need to have your birthright. And Esau's mindset is so confused that he says, well, I'm about to die. What good is my birthright? Now think about this for a minute. You do the math, okay? If I'm going to die, I don't need my birthright, so let me have the soup because I'm going to die. Everybody got it? What happens if you eat the soup? You don't die. If you don't die, what might you need? A birthright. This guy couldn't pick cotton if he's made out of Velcro. Listen, he's not smart on any level. He comes in here, and maybe in his mind he says, sell my birthright? That's not really a thing. You really can't do that. I mean, you can't make me be unborn and come back as the youngest son. So maybe he makes this decision thinking it really can't happen. Guess what? It can happen. You can get addicted. You can get caught. You can flirt with somebody and it turn into an affair. You can message somebody on Facebook over and over and over, and it becomes an inverse in intimacy. Don't think this thing's not a thing. Now, had Esau taken his eyes off that red soup and just merely looked around that camp, what do you think he'd have seen? Lots of food. His father is Isaac, his grandfather is Abraham. Abraham wasn't a homeless dude living under the bridge in Palestine. Abraham was a rich Middle Eastern sheik. Abraham had an army of 300 men. If you've got an army, you know what you've got? Groceries. Because an army won't stay where they're not being fed. But he only focuses, you've heard of the oldest trick in the book? That's the oldest trick in the book. This is what you can't have. When that serpent talked to that woman in that garden, he didn't ask her, what can you eat? He asked her, what can't you eat? And what did she do? Man, that looks awfully good. I wish you could eat it. Esau looks at the one thing he can't have. And because of the one thing he can't have, he traded what he wanted most for what he wanted now. And when he made that bad decision, the Bible says that he wanted to redo it. And he found no place for repentance, even though he sought it diligently and with tears. What kind of deals are you making today? What kind of trades are you making? Everything you say yes to represents something else you say no to. And everything you say yes to invites friends to the party. What are you saying yes to and what are you saying no to? And are you giving up on the inheritance that your father has promised you for some immediate short-term relief or gratification? Because a lot of times we quit Christianity just because it got uncomfortable, not realizing that the discomfort will eventually pass. And if you are uncomfortable and miserable and persecuted and rotting in a jail for 70 years, what's that compared to eternity? What do you want now? What do you want most? What's holding you back from running? Look at the crowd of people that have lived before you that didn't quit. And are you making a foolish choice and focusing on what you can't have, or are you focusing on what God's already promised you? If you can sort out those decisions, you can overcome struggles with your Christianity. You can overcome the decision to make a short-term choice that has long-term consequences, or you can make a long-term choice and override all the short-term consequences. If you're making bad choices, let us help you this afternoon while we stand, while we sing.